Welcome back, everybody. Today we're talking about Shadow War builds for the Blood Knight, and this has been a really popular topic, and I want to talk about a few things before we get into the actual build. First up is I want to talk about how Blood Knight compares to other melee classes, and more specifically about how they buff party members. The Barbarian has the ability to increase party members' speed and their damage through Battlemaster's Helm and Swiftwind Pants. Crusader obviously has Banner, which many people are aware of. They also have Conjuration of Light, which is valuable if you're putting it on your party members and giving them more uptime on the target. The Guardian has the ability to hit very hard, so increasing your uptime is allowing you to do more damage. Monk has also got Empathy's Blessing, which is a massive damage increase to players within the aura. They also can modify Shield of Zen to increase movement speed of party members as well. And on top of that, they have a whole bunch of dashes, which they can travel around the map and stay on the target, including a primary attack with Fist of Thunder, which allows them to teleport directly to that target. And the Blood Knight has, well, doesn't really have that much when you think about it, right? They got one essence that's going to modify Sanguinate to reducing the target's armor for 3 seconds. That's a really short period of time for other players to land attacks and get benefit of that essence. And on top of that, if we run Sanguinate in the build, it doesn't do a ton of damage itself, and we may need to use Sanguinate to move around, in which case we may miss the target or not be close enough to hit the target and apply that debuff. So I just don't find it a good choice. It is an option, and I want to mention it. It's really the only thing I can think of offhand that Blood Knights can really bring to benefit their party. So when we talk about Blood Knights in the Shadow War, I want to be very clear that I think this is hands down the worst class for Shadow War that you could be. But we need to make use of it somehow, and if you're playing this class, it's going to be all about increasing your own damage, especially with obviously single target in the Shadow War, and we're going to do that through maximizing our uptime. So we need to use a mix of abilities that either deal damage or deal damage over time, meaning we apply it to the target and they still take damage while we're out of range of it, and then some skills to either increase our movement or our mobility. So that's what this basis of this build is. Now I'm running 4-piece Grace, 2-piece Vithus. We're going to have 2 skills that have damage over time components. The rest of this is going to be a mix of, like I said, closing the gap and attacking the target. One thing that's come up numerous times since the launch of Blood Knight is people saying Blood Knight's not really immobile, or Blood Knight actually has a lot of mobility. I disagree with that, and it has to do kind of with the way you think about it. The class innately doesn't have much mobility. They've got one skill, Sanguinate, which you can use as a dash. Everything else requires an essence to transform a skill in order to get said mobility or the gap closer. And what that does is really funnel or pigeonhole you into certain choices and making them really mandatory, or force you into kind of using the same things over and over. And that's why we see a lot of these skills being used repeatedly in many different builds. Skewer with the crashing dash, yep. Seen that in how many builds. You can use that for farm, you can use that in dungeons, you can use that in the Shadow War, you can use that in rifts, pretty much anywhere, because it's one of the better tools for moving around. So let's go ahead and take a look. We're going to be using Skewer, Whirling Strike, Siphon Blood, Swarm of Bats, and Shadow's Edge. Regardless of what you do here for skills, whether you change this, I definitely recommend Shadow's Edge over the Ravage at this point. Is just a superior ability in my opinion. And for the Shadow War, just having that mid-range attack is infinitely better than being melee, at least in my opinion. For essences, we're going to start off with Horns of the Hex. This is the only essence we're using to modify Siphon Blood. This allows it to no longer be channeled, and we're going to primarily try to make use of this in conjunction with Swarm of Bats, but you can pop it independently as well. Just depends on the situation, but for the most part, you're going to have a lot of sustain by popping the Siphon Blood and then the Swarm of Bats. And the reason for that is because we're running Solemn Snare. Solemn Snare is going to make you untargetable, meaning if we have the Siphon Blood active and we're untargetable, we can deal some damage to the target or the statue and recuperate some rather than backing out to bandage. Could really be a game changer, allowing you to immediately get uptime when you come out of there. Using an ability or an attack, primary attack that is, will break this form. So make sure when you cast this, you either let it run its duration or you do something else in a planned manner. Don't just accidentally hit your primary. Also for Swarm of Bats, we have Corruptor and Trade. This is just going to increase the damage. This will be 19% when you have maxed Essence Mastery, as well as an additional 10% if you have it awakened. So this just adds a substantial chunk. And again, keep in mind that Swarm Bats can be used either directly on top of the target, or if they happen to leap, you can still use Swarm of Bats to close that gap. It has a relatively short cooldown, so feel free to use it kind of whenever you need. You don't have to reserve it for strictly being on top of the target. In the pants, we're running Faces of Fading Mirth, again for Swarm of Bats. This is going to add a damage over time in the form of poison, and it also has a very large modifier. The higher your Essence Mastery, the better that's going to be. This will benefit off of Grace, as well as the Red Concord main hand. This is going to be for Whirling Strike. It's going to add a burn component. So there's our two abilities that are going to do damage over time, and we want this. And the reason for that is because if we hit the target and it starts moving or goes out of our range, at least we're dealing some damage. And as I mentioned, this is going to be all about having uptime on the target. In the offhand slot, or rather both slots I should say, we're buffing Shadow's Edge, and this is because we've got that mid-range attack. This is going to be a large source of our damage. Paired with the Weaver Paragon tree where we're using our abilities and our auto attacks, in my opinion, this is going to be the best way to maximize our damage within the Shadow War. So this first one is just going to add increased damage from the Ricochet. Now there's no other nearby enemies to get this Ricochet, so we're hoping for basically this Awaken property here. If you don't have this Awaken property, there may be another choice that you want to swap into this build, potentially for something else, or if you modify the build. But if you happen to have an offhand slot Awaken, this will be your best choice just for that Awakened buff. A second slot you're going to want to use regardless of whether it's awakened or not. This is Mercy's Plight. This is going to mark the target, and after you reach 4 marks, they're going to take additional damage. This also scales very well with Essence Mastery, 30% per additional level, and this is going to be huge. Like I said, we're going to be weaving skills and primary attacks, with primaries probably doing a larger chunk of damage than you would expect. So this is going to be very important. For the other main hand, we're running the Basalver, and this is going to transform Skewer into that Leaping Crash that we know. And also keep in mind that Skewer does more damage than you would expect. So if you have the choice, in my opinion, when you close that gap, you want to kind of land on the target with Skewer, not necessarily nearby or anything like that. Now, obviously, you're just getting additional damage from that Skewer. You can always essentially stutter step, meaning you throw a primary, move a little, throw a primary, move a little bit, and reposition after landing with the Skewer, provided you have the sustainability. Another option you can do is dash in with that Skewer, pop your Siphon Blood right away, get your sustainability, and keep your uptime in that regard. So let's go ahead and take a look on the map here, and we'll just pretend that we're in a Shadow War and trying to move around. Now, like I said, if the target is going to leap, and this is obviously not talking about stationary statues, this is a competitive type Shadow War where we're relying on our build to get some uptime and kind of contribute, being, again, probably the weakest class in there. So we have Skewer to move around. If we can't close the gap with Skewer, we still have Swarm of Bats. And you'll see that we're basically going to get a charge back of Skewer fairly soon. And you can certainly use these in the other order, like I said. But we can cover a fair amount of ground, right? And I did that fairly quickly. I can get from here to here, and that's about as far as you would need to travel in the Shadow War. Now, if you're anticipating that they might have a double leap, it may be better to kind of use your Swarm of Bats. If you see them leap back, you've still got some charge going. Or if they continue in the same direction, you can Skewer twice. As you get near the target, obviously you'll be throwing off your primary attacks. And you've got Whirling Strike. And keep in mind how big this radius is of Whirling Strike. So even if you're shooting this mid-range attack, as long as you're somewhat close, you'll hit them, get that burn component on them, and just leave some additional damage even as the target starts to move. Your sustainability is going to be in the form of this Siphon Blood. You'll want to essentially, ideally, crash into the target, pop the Siphon Blood, and maybe even go into Swarm of Bats, making sure you won't take any additional damage, and kind of regenerate or recoup your health in that manner. Certainly will tell as we see more Shadow Wars and get the results and so forth, but I really think that comparing the Blood Knight to something like Demon Hunter is going to be night and day, and I just think there's no comparison to be made. It's important when we're critiquing the builds to really check your performance to other players of the same class, hopefully with a similar resonance within your own clan, so that you're fighting within the same battle and kind of measure the performance that way. I know that's not always an accessible option for everybody, but we also have videos and we can get feedback from the community in comments and so forth. So feel free to let me know and let others know how this build performs to you. As always, thanks for taking the time to watch and have a great day.